book is written for students of linguistics, especially, I think, Boston College students of linguistics. I think I had those in mind when I wrote, because the discipline of linguistics, at least in the U.S., is deeply, deeply ahistorical at this time in the beginning of the 21st century. I think my own training in linguistics is probably typical, because in my graduate studies, there was very little reference to any kind of study of language outside of the last maybe 40 years. And I took a single course in the history of linguistics, but like most of the graduate students in the program I was with, really discounted the content of it. And so I graduated with a PhD in linguistics with very little sense of where the field that I was devoted to had come from. I gradually came to really regret that and wish that I knew more about the history of linguistics and the study of languages, and my research field turned in that direction at that point. There are plenty of linguists in the United States and even in Europe who feel that the study of language is so different in the Chomskyan era, which is to say post-1959, that virtually no study of language before that date has relevance to the kind of research that's happening right now. I regret that, and I hope that BC students don't graduate with that kind of impression of the history of the discipline. So I took up the study of the history of linguistics to try to correct my own ignorance, and it became a kind of fascination of mine. The book is a collection of short biographies and intellectual biographies of linguists who have made a big contribution to the discipline internationally. And it starts with an Indian grammarian from the 4th or 5th century and goes up to the present day. My purpose in writing the book was, or the kind of model I held in my mind as I wrote the book, was how to help educate students of linguistics so that they're prepared to meet people who have been really influential in the field. And the kind of metaphor I had for writing the book was that I was the hostess throwing a party, and I had invited famous linguists throughout the ages to attend this party, and also some students who were just entering the discipline. And in advance of the party, I wanted to prepare the students to know something about the other famous guests. And so, as if I was driving them on the way to the party, and they were in the back seat, and I was talking to them about some of the people they would meet, preparing them to have good conversations with important figures in the field. And it became a useful metaphor for me, too, because I then began to select people who I think would be essential personalities and essential, that represented essential subfields that students needed to know about in order to feel at home in the discipline. Among the people that I selected were some people who were very well known by other linguists, although, as I said earlier, most professional linguists don't pay much attention to the history of the discipline, and yet they're important names that they know something of. And also a number of people who don't have very high profiles, but who represented bodies of knowledge and advances in the discipline that are still critical for our understanding the current state of the discipline. And one that I want to tell you about is a Korean, actually he was a king in Korea in the 15th century. His name was King Sejong. He is honored in Korean national history as a great pioneer who introduced a lot of technological innovations and brought peace to the country. He was involved in the production of the sort of innovations in printing, in agricultural science, and law. But from a linguistic perspective, his great accomplishment was that he created, and apparently single-handedly, a new orthography, a new writing system for the Korean language. And it's a technical marvel. It's a beautiful invention that I feel that anyone who is interested in language, which basically includes everyone I've ever met, should know something about it. What's interesting about his innovation, which is called Hangul, and it's still used today in both North and South Korea, is the basis on which he decided to build the orthography. Middle Korean, which is what was spoken in the 14th century, already had a writing system that was borrowed from Chinese. But the Chinese language and the Korean language are radically different in every way that languages can be different. So that it was trying to write Korean in Chinese is a very bad fit because the properties of the language are so different. So King Sejong had the idea of creating a new way to write Korean that would be more accessible to the people. In particular, he wrote that he wanted more common people to be able to write instead of writing the special province of scribes. And what's really amazing about his innovation is the basis on which he decided to try to record language. Most orthographic systems are based on speech, which is to say individual words or individual units of sound are represented by particular symbols, and then they're arrayed in a particular order. And in that way, someone can confront a written language and out of that reproduce speech. But King Sejong decided to create an orthographic tradition that is based on the kind of subatomic particles of speech, which is to say, if you think of a letter, for example, in an orthographic tradition like the ones of Europe, you think of a letter like, say, K in English. So that represents a sound, k. But that sound can be broken down into smaller units based on the place of articulation in the mouth of the K-type sound and the manner in which it's produced. And King Sejong's insight was to try to create an orthography of Korean that was based on those sort of sub-sound units. So he created the Hangul orthography, which represents language actually on several different levels. At the most basic level, the individual sound properties of Korean are resolved into their constituent features, so that the particular symbols that are used to transcribe consonants in Korean are actually a collection of the features that have to do with the place of articulation of the sound. Like a k is pronounced fairly far back in your mouth, as opposed to, say, a p, like a p-type sound, which is in the front of your mouth. And the symbols that are used to transcribe those sounds are actually tiny pictures of the position of your articulators, of your tongue and your lips, when you create a sound that's in the back of your mouth versus the front of your mouth. So the consonants are actually iconic with respect to the place of articulation of the sub-features of each individual sound. And so he created he resolved words into, first of all, into syllables, and the syllables into consonants and vowels, so that each syllable is a tiny diagram in which are represented the places of articulation of the various consonants, and in the center of each diagram is a representation of the vowel that forms the nucleus of that syllable. So if you have a syllable like, say, Kim, it has a particular symbol which represents the place of articulation of the k and the and in the center there's a representation of the vowel. Vowels fall into various subclasses, and the pictures that he used to represent the vowels are likewise show their relationship to each other from subclass to subclass. Even more amazingly, King Sejong also places a dot within each one of those syllable graphemes to represent the tone of the particular syllable, because Middle Korean was a pitch accent language, and there were high, low, and rising tones. And those are represented within each of those units as well. Compared to Chinese, which has very scant sound properties in the individual characters, the writing of Korean was a huge innovation. And it takes a different track than even Japanese, which was and Japanese scholars were taught orthography by their Korean counterparts. So it's an amazing, fantastic kind of invention. And I feel that students of linguistics should know something about facts like that from the past, and that enriches their understanding. And also, it is relevant to the study of orthographic systems that's ongoing right now, because that study has been very influenced by the notion that that orthography resolves language into speech, whereas King Sejong's insight was that it could be resolved even further into the tiny atomic particles of speech. So King Sejong is one of the people that I discuss in this book because I think it's important to bring his kind of insight forward. But the book covers, covers a large chronological period, and also goes off into various different cultures as well, as much as is possible within the confines of a single book. The notion of sort of resolution of language into features comes back again in our own century in the work of another person who's mentioned in the book, namely a Russian philologist named Roman Jakobson. I had to include Roman Jakobson in our book in my book because of his actual importance to my department at Boston College. Roman Jakobson, in his later life, taught at Harvard and MIT, and one of his direct students founded my own Department of Slavic and Eastern Languages in 1968. And we feel that his spirit is still alive in our department. His interest in both language and literature and his abundant enthusiasm for all things linguistic, we feel we're still harboring his spirit in our department. He had a fantastically adventurous life and was a dynamo of intellectual, complex intellectual analysis of language of a very original sort. He was born in Moscow and raised in Moscow right at the time of the Russian Revolution. And I think that his early upbringing perhaps accustomed him to living under like external turmoil while sort of holding himself together through his strong personal relationships with his peers. He was involved in the futurist movement as a teenager and a college student in Moscow. He emigrated away from Moscow to Czechoslovakia in 1920 and settled there and began to work with other students of linguistics and linguistic scholars in Prague. He became part of the so-called Prague School of Linguistics, which is still very active and influential in Europe and a little bit less so in the United States. It's a school of the study of language that prioritizes functional property of language. So the Prague linguists are very, they focus on the way in which language is used in communication. They feel that that's important function of the function of language impacts on its form, and they're interested in studying the relationship between communicative function and formal properties of language. Roman Jakobson was one of the leading spirits of the development of functionalism in Prague. In the 1930s, it was no longer possible, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, it was no longer possible for him to continue in Prague because of the advance of the Nazis, and he fled to Scandinavia and eventually to the United States. During that period of tremendous sort of personal upheaval were some of his most productive years. He developed a notion of the resolution of the minimal sounds of language into features, which is something of the same kind of insight that King Sejong had hundreds of years earlier. But Roman Jakobson worked that out in a different domain of language and pushed it back to not just the representation of language in writing, but the analysis of language on many different levels. So he was one of the proponents in the Prague School of the idea that speech sounds should be represented not so much with respect to their articulatory properties, but with respect to their acoustic properties. He felt that both vowels and consonants could be represented using the same components. And he worked out a very elaborate system of resolving the differences between p and k and t and e and a and o into binary features, a kind of collection of binary features. This was a disruptive notion in Europe at the time because of Ferdinand de Saussure's insistence that language is communicated in a linear form, that the units of language are concatenated and communicated in linear form. Because according to Roman Jakobson, if language can be resolved into features, then pieces of information about language are communicated simultaneously at a steady pace. During his Scandinavian Odyssey in 1940, he published a book that has been translated and was extremely influential, called Language Universals, Child Language and Aphasia. And in that book, he puts forward, he develops his idea of the distinctive features of the sound properties of language and makes a further claim that children learning a language learn to control the features of language in a specific order that holds across various languages. So that children learning language in Sweden develop this minimal properties of sound in a particular order, which is also true of German children learning German and Russian children learning Russian. And moreover, Jakobson claimed that the dissolution of language, for example, in cases of aphasia, brain damage in which people lose control over language, that the dissolution of language takes place in a mirror opposite order, so that people lose this, the last features that children acquired are the first features that aphasics lose. It was a really remarkable and kind of audacious and original claim that he made that's still being investigated, and some of it, has proved controversial. Anyways, after Jakobson's stay in Scandinavia, he came to the US, lived in New York for a while, and then came to Cambridge and taught at Harvard and MIT, where he interacted with the early founders of generative linguistics centered at MIT, and in that way influenced a whole new generation of people about his, spread his idea, in particular, of distinctive features to the originators of generative grammar, and they used the notion of distinctive features and applied it to morphology and grammar and larger chunks of linguistics. And he, as I said, he also helped found our Department of Slavic and Eastern Languages here at BC. So Jakobson is an example of another person who I feel that students of linguistics need to meet on the pages of his own original work in order to become fully educated about the background of the discipline. So my book is a collection of vignettes about the history of linguistics. It ends, of course, it comes up to the present day, and one of the key figures who probably most people will be most interested in reading about is this chapter on Noam Chomsky, because he's probably the most important and well-known living linguist, certainly in the United States. Very controversial person as well. One thing that's interesting is that Chomsky's own contributions to the field of linguistics have made many people feel that the past study of language can be readily discredited. In fact, there are statements that you can find in the literature that say really very explicitly things like more has been learned about language in the past 30 or 40 years than all of the previous history of linguistics. I don't think that that's an adequate basis for the study of language, and so I object to statements like that. But nevertheless, they're revealing, because the basis of Chomsky, the basis of Chomsky's, the basis of his having renewed the field of language probably resides in his observation about the nature of child language acquisition. He feels that previous study of language has tried to look at the superficial facts of language, so the language that what people say, how they say it, what they mean when they say it, and that people have assembled varieties of linguistic output from many different cultures and many different languages, and then try to understand language in general by, by comparing those, making cross-linguistic comparisons across many different languages. And his approach is radically different. He says that in order to understand the nature of language, we have to find out what people know about language that they can't have learned from the environment. So he probes, for example, what small children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, know about language and what they don't do with language, which can't have been produced by what they've observed about a language in the environment. So his approach is to probe into a single language very deeply at an abstract level, and then to deduce the nature of that kind of knowledge and attribute it to a language faculty, presumably shared by all human beings. And that's the basis of people's, and because language is being approached in his wake from that point of view, he feels that language, that the study of language has been put on a different basis that makes the past of linguistics irrelevant. However, what's interesting is that he himself, Chomsky himself, is actually very interested in the history of language and history of language and linguistics, and has written several different books about the history of linguistics. They're probably his least read writings. They're very controversial among historians of linguistics, but he links together his ideas to certain ideas of the 16th and 17th century France, when in his view, there was a sort of flourishing of rationalist view of language, where people began to look into the basis of single languages instead of looking cross-linguistically. And he places his own work in a tradition that he connects back to the 1660s in France. Many historians of linguistics dispute that claim on all kinds of bases. But it's interesting that the person for whom the history of language, whose work is placed at the heart of a totally new level of linguistic inquiry, works hard to try to connect his work to the past. And in that endeavor, I completely concur with him. I think it's important to look back to try to discover how language was treated and understood in different generations and in different cultures, because that enriches students' understanding of the discipline and makes their work more important and more powerful and more long-lasting. In writing this book, I was gratified to have at my fingertips the resources of O'Neill Library, and beyond O'Neill, the consortium of libraries that O'Neill belongs to, and Interlibrary Loan. I couldn't possibly have reveled in the primary sources and the whole secondary literature of these various figures without the gracious help of O'Neill Library. And so I feel that I have co-authored this book along with the librarians and the Interlibrary Loan people at O'Neill Library. It's also made me appreciate what a library is, too, which is an historical collection of materials that have been preserved for people to use in the future. So, in effect, my book is a kind of library of its own, presented to students of the discipline.